According to Christina Holtz and a multitude of many other scholars focusing on museum activism, activist museum exhibitions are exhibitions that respectfully represent the underrepresented, cooperate with the underrepresented, publicly debate the problems of the underrepresented, and engage in the actions of the underrepresented. With that, I'm wondering whether the experiences I had in November of 2019 when the Workers' Museum in Copenhagen invited a group of youth activists to occupy the museum space could be considered a form of museum activism. And what could that mean for the museum space and its inclusivity of underrepresented voices? Now, let's begin with the actual event itself. In November of 2019, the Workers' Museum has been working on a project called Museum Rebels for quite some time. Museum Rebels is a project that's focusing on including the voices of young people as part of the museum project, which is to focus on helping young people understand their democratic voices in society and to use them. With this, they're focusing on Museum Rebels, which is focusing on including young people in the construction of museum spaces. They have before invited these museum rebels to go through museum exhibitions and give their feedback as to whether this exhibition kind of fit in with how a young person might interpret the space. As part of that, they then, in November of 2019, invited Børnemagt, or in English, Children's Power, an anti-authoritarian youth organization, which focuses a lot on incorporating the voices of young people and advocating for the voices of young people in democratic positions, to occupy the museum space as part of the 30-year anniversary of the UN Children's Conventions. The purpose of the day was to then invite 100 school children to take part in various parallel workshops run by the activists, who would then discuss what it meant to be a young person today and whether the children's convention was outdated, needing improvement, and all these different other questions, all under focus on what the young people wanted to do. It was kind of very much stressed that this was constructed by the sort of children's power activists with help from the museum. If we go back to what Christina Holt says, that activist museum exhibitions respectfully represent the underrepresented, cooperate with them, and publicly debate the problems of them. Well, children and young people are a group of people that are underrepresented when it comes to museum exhibitions, because even though they make up a large part of the visiting audience, a lot of the exhibition spaces, currently the ones who've been there for a long time in Denmark, were constructed with the notion of the sort of adult person in mind. Secondly, the sort of bodies and voices of children in the construction of these exhibitions is also very much non-existent, and if it's included, it's mostly focusing on very much the educational focus. So what Workers Museum was hoping to do with this was to bring in these young people and give them an active say in how they understand activism, but also use this as an opportunity for these activist young people to discuss activism with fellow young people and to provide the museum as a space for this to happen. Now, this day was also meant to then be part of a museum exhibition on activism, which is meant to be opening next year. And due to the COVID lockdown, it's uncertain how exactly this is going to fit in. But it does come to show that the museum is taking an active role in trying to bring in the underrepresented voices, which would then be a form of activism. At the same time, there's this sort of weird notion of construction. How authentic is an occupation of a space if the occupants are invited to do so by the owners? Is it then sort of truly authentic, and does that authenticity really matter in the greater scheme of things? In the context of this sort of occupation, if you would call it that, it didn't really come to show, but it did bring in some very important power imbalances between the activists, students, teachers, and museum staff, with the museum staff very clearly having set some boundaries. They, for example, said that the activists couldn't destroy the entire museum as they might have done in a different situation because there are historical objects in there with significant value. So in that sense, they've kind of created some parameters for what the activists were allowed to do. So it wasn't as freely of an occupation as the activists may have wanted to. Secondly, there was also this sort of uncertainty in between the power role that the sort of activists had to, because they were still young people who were then given the position to be educators and take on this role in front of 100 pupils of similar age to them. And they were given the power to then control everything, which a lot of them then afterwards said was giving them a lot of uncertainties and insecurities, because they are actively against telling people what to do. They want young people to make their own decisions. And yet, in order for this workshop to run as it was supposed to, they had to make some decisions on who would go where and how. And this sort of imbalance also came to fruition when the teachers then stepped in and would kind of try and encourage, and in some points also sort of force their pupils to stay in the room when the pupils didn't want to take part in the workshops, whilst the activists were on the other side trying to say that these young people had the voices of and the freedom to make their own decisions. So if I go back to what Christina Holtz said, she talks about how this is also about making sure that the underrepresented shouldn't be taken advantage of, and that the museum holds a significant responsibility to ensure that they are clear in these power imbalances, which, talking to the museum staff, they did try to be aware of that, and they did try to make sure that this was an equal power work relationship, but in of itself, that's also difficult. Now, I'm going to finish off this very brief presentation of my article by saying that I also think this is a discussion about inclusivity. How is this in relation to including young people's voices, which it was a significant thing for the museum to do. You will see that the exhibition is likely going to have a banner, which the young people painted during this sort of workshop. This was not originally meant to be. This was because the museum activists proudly discussed the exhibition in the making, and then described that the banners they were making would be part of the exhibition space, which one of the museum staff whispering to me then said, well, I guess we have to do that now. So they did have this sort of idea that the event on this day was going to sort of be part of at least the discussions of the museum exhibition that's opening next year, but they hadn't thought further as to include some of the objects and the artifacts that were constructed on the day. So in that sense, the activists suddenly started taking on that role of sort of pushing their voices into the exhibition spaces, which kind of brings again that sort of power imbalance. I wish I could talk for longer about this, but unfortunately, due to a lot of the COVID lockdowns, I unfortunately haven't been able to get as far with this article as possible. But the article in itself is meant to discuss this idea of museum spaces as activist and political spaces. And I think what this sort of constructed occupation can show us is, in many ways, how museums can take on a more sort of active role in at least sort of respectfully representing the underrepresented, which in this case is young people's voices in relation to activism. In a lot of ways, they also can be shown to sort of publicly debate the problems of the underrepresented. They invite young people in to talk to other young people about what it's like to be a young person today. And they did it in the open whilst the museum was open and guests were walking around. So they're bringing to fruition this idea of the young voice. And finally, there's this notion of engaging in the actions of the underrepresented. Now, that's one thing they might not have done so much. Now, Christina Holtz talks about these three levels of museum activism, and if I can very briefly try and conclude this article, I would say that the Workers' Museum and this sort of co-constructed occupation with children's power would fall under this sort of mid-tier level of museum activism, which is also a form of including these sort of voices. And I hope this has been a very brief sort of introduction to what I've been working on, and with that, I hope that maybe some people can give me some great suggestions for how I can move on with it. Thank you.